little oaks, how are you all? I'm going to tell you the story today of Mrs. Honey's hat. And if Mrs. Honey turns round very carefully, you can see all the beautiful things that were on her hat at the beginning of the story. Let's see what happens to change it. Mrs. Honey had a hat, and on Monday she wore it when she took her grandson Peter to the park. She brought him some bubble gum and sat on a bench with her knitting. Peter thought those feathers would be very good for my arrows, so he pulled the feathers off the hat and left his bubble gum on the brim. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. So I'm going to take off the feathers. You usually help me with this, don't you? And pop the bubble gum on her hat. Let's see what happens next. On Tuesday, Mrs. Honey wore her hat when she went to visit a friend. They sat in the garden in the shade of a big tree and ate some of the cakes. It was a lovely cake. It was Mary Berry's recipe. It was a tray bake. It was delicious. Some birds flew down to pick up the crumbs. Those cherries look good, they chirped, and they flew off with them. One of the birds left some eggs behind, but Mrs. Honey didn't notice. So we need to take off the cherries and put on the eggs. Put those on the brim of the hat. On Wednesday, Mrs. Honey spent a day at the seaside. The sun shone and the water was just right for paddling, and Mrs. Honey felt very happy. Oh, I do like to be beside the seaside. Let's see what happens. Afterwards, Mrs. Honey took off her hat and sat in the sun. A hermit crab thought that the shell would make a nice new home, so he scuttled away with the shell and left some seaweed behind instead. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. So I'm going to take off the shell, which the hermit crab's going to live in, and I'm going to put some rather stinky seaweed on her hat instead. Do you think you would have noticed that your hat was changing? I think I probably would. On Thursday, Mrs. Honey picked some dandelions to make some wine. It was very hard work, and she took off her hat and put it on the fence. So I wonder what the cow's going to do. A cow in the field saw the hat. Moo! What beautiful buttercups, she mooed. So she took a mouthful and her bell fell onto Mrs. Honey's hat. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. So I'm going to take off the buttercups and we're going to put on the bell. On Friday, Mrs. Honey went to an old castle. I expect some of you have been to castles. Maybe you've been to Windsor Castle. Just look at those cobwebs, explained Mrs. Honey. This place could do with a very good clean. A big black spider dropped onto her hat. Let's see. This lace will make a very good strong cobweb, he thought. So he hurried away with the lace and left his old webs behind. But Mrs. Honey didn't notice. So let's take off the lace and put on the cobwebs onto her hat. On Saturday, Mrs. Honey took her cat to a cat show. There were lots of cats, and she hoped hers would win first prize. And which cat do you think might be Mrs. Honey's cat? We'll find out in a minute. An alley cat saw Mrs. Honey's hat through the window. That ribbon might help me win first prize, he thought. So he pulled it from the hat and left some fish bones behind. But Mrs. Honey still didn't notice. So he's taking the beautiful pink ribbon and he's putting on some very smelly fish bones. Now, let's see if we can have a look at the cats again and see if we can see the one with the pink ribbon on. So I'm just going to put Mrs. Honey down and let's have a look. I think it could have been that cat, don't you? But I think that's Mrs. Honey's cat, and that's a cat with a pink ribbon that the alley cat, there's the alley cat, thought he'd like to look like. I've got a grey cat like Mrs. Honey's cat, and she's very, very grumpy. On Sunday, Mrs. Honey went to church and everybody seemed to be staring at her. Whatever can it be, she thought. Everybody's just staring at me. It's really embarrassing. I really don't like it. Perhaps it's time I brought a new hat.